Since 2013, Canada has been acknowledging September 30th, Orange Shirt Day, a day to reflect upon the harms inflicted upon Indigenous children and their families in the residential school system. In 2021, Canada also began to recognize the day as the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day to honor the children who never returned home, survivors of residential schools, and their communities. The Society of United Professionals Indigenous Relations Circle acknowledges that public commemoration of the painful history and intergenerational impacts of the residential school system is crucial to its journey of reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission played a pivotal role in addressing the painful legacy of residential schools in Canada. By way of an introduction to your work, could you share what your specific contributions were within this profound process and your insights on what the TRC sought to achieve?
Sure. So I was really fortunate. At that time, I was working with the Assembly of First Nations under the leadership of National Chief Phil Fontaine, who was just so dedicated to ensuring the voices of survivors were heard, and worked out a commitment with then Prime Minister Paul Martin that we would enter into a process to ensure that happened. Part of that process was negotiating the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So I was part of the team that worked on the negotiation of that settlement agreement. And in that agreement, one of the really historic parts of it was to a commitment to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Subsequent to that agreement being ratified right across the country, I was asked to lead the process to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I had this amazing, amazing team that I worked with professionals from across the country and support from other parts of the world to establish the TRC, work closely with government, churches, the Assembly of First Nations, survivors. And so I think my contribution was just kind of guiding the ship. And it was really the team that I worked with that were so amazing, and the support of survivors to see this TRC established. So I'm really proud that we were able to do this. I think there was real questions about whether or not we could stand up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm really proud that Canada is the first world country to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's a big deal. So I'm proud that we did this. That's
awesome. I feel like these are like the moments where I kind of like fangirl over the fact that I get to work with you. So
you can leave that in.
Yeah, make sure that makes it into the video. Bob, what have been some of the most unexpected personal challenges that you faced while working on Truth and Reconciliation, and how have you navigated them?
Well, getting the commission stood up it had a lot of challenges. It was pretty clear that the government had a certain agenda of what it expected from a TRC and tried to persuade us that we should do things a particular way. Our vision was really to try to manifest the principles and values that were in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And so there was conflict at times during that process about the role of government, the role of the Privy Council Office in terms of trying to predetermine what the TRC might look like and how it might function. And money was an issue too in terms of establishing this. And so we had to build arguments to ensure that the TRC was funded sufficiently so that it could do its job. And you can imagine that's a bit of a battle. And then there was like subtle things where we were being told, like, you know, maybe Canadians aren't ready for the truth. So is there a way of just kind of going easy and being truthful, but not maybe the whole truth sort of thing? So there's all these nuances that had to be navigated. I got fired like 3 times setting up the TRC, and then got hired like back the next week. So it was a really political process. I remember meeting with Michael Ignatieff, who wrote a lot about the TRC in South Africa, and just to get advice from him. And he said, Bob, he said, just know this, as much as this seems like, revolutionary and a wonderful process, and that people like Desmond Tutu were like saint-like, he was also like an amazing politician, because it's a political process as much as it's anything. And I experienced all of that in terms of the work. The other part of it that was so gratifying was going out and consulting with survivors on what they expected. And those were like incredibly tearful, emotional, painful gatherings, where sometimes, we might want to talk, what does an archive look like? And people wanted to disclose what had happened to them. And there was a sea of tears that were shed as we were trying to develop the TRC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so understanding these challenges and the experiences that you went through, how do you think that that's influenced your approach to your work?
One of the things that I found out that a phrase that I used a lot was manifest the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And I think that was really important. That was kind of like a bedrock piece for us, that if we were dedicated to putting a process in place aimed at reconciliation, that we had to walk the walk. We couldn't just say, well, we're working on reconciliation, but act in a manner that's inconsistent with reconciliation. So, and that's one thing that I've taken to every job that I've had, is manifest the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So at the NWMO, if we're trying to achieve partnership or good relations, or try to create greater understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, you have to act in a fashion that manifests that all the way along, because you don't get there unless you put those pieces in place on the journey. And it's kind of simplistic, but I think it's kind of profound too at the same time, maybe because it's got bigger words or something. I don't know, but that was a big lesson for me. And I guess the other big lesson was how generosity can come from really unexpected places. And don't presume or assume that somebody thinks this way or will act that way just because of their background or their appearance or anything else. That human beings are full of surprises, both good and bad. But it's part of like being open to meet people where they want to be met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great advice. Are there any stories or perspectives related to reconciliation that you feel are often overlooked or not widely shared?
I think the voice of survivors still needs to be shared more broadly. The TRC did a fabulous job in terms of documenting those voices. Not everybody had a chance to be heard, and I know there's other processes that are going on to sort of as follow-up to the TRC to try to document people's histories. And then I think the question is like, is taking that and putting that into a format that's easily accessible by Canadians and people in other parts of the world, because other parts of the world are looking at Canada to try to see, what did the TRC do, and what's the ongoing role in terms of those calls to action, and how can legacies be be worked on, and how can new futures be created that are mindful of history. So all those things are all happening at the same time. The other thing that I think gets overlooked is some of the heroes that worked at residential schools that really tried to protect the children, and government officials like Dr. Peter Bryce, who wrote that paper, National Crime, exposing what was going on in residential schools and got fired for telling the truth. I mean, there's a lot of people that really tried to protect children, to help children keep their culture, keep their language. Sometimes I don't think those voices are appreciated, that it would be easy to say, you know, all the people that worked at residential schools were, you know, fill in the blank. And that's, I think, not being mindful that different people brought different values and principles to the work that they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. What do you think can be done to bring some of these voices and stories more to the forefront?
I think, you know, some of the work that's being done in terms of documentaries, some of the films that are being made. We have musicals that are being done, and plays, books. So I think there's increasingly those stories are more accessible. I know some of the work that Downey Wenjack Fund is doing, and other institutions that are dedicated to truth and reconciliation are increasingly trying to make things more and more accessible. I mean, what's accessible in my definition is way different than what's accessible to, you know, a 16-year-old in terms of how they receive information and how they process information. Like reading a book, which I really enjoy, I imagine a lot of people are like, there's still books? I don't know, but I think there's different ways that people learn and receive information. So thinking about that in terms of accessibility of information is really critical, because we want those young people to be learning and helping to create that different future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that actually, when you say that, it makes me think of like the approach that the Downey Wenjack Fund is taking and really trying to make this like an intergenerational learning experience. So people that know Gord Downey may not know a whole lot about what happened with the residential school system, and people who are learning about the residential school system now don't really have that context of what Gord did for the Wenjack family.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people, when you mention the Tragically Hip or Gord Downey, like it just opens doors. It's magic. And there's other people like, Tragically Hip, what was that? You know, it sounds like a bad orthopedic surgery or something.
As an aside, it's funny, there's actually a band that performs a lot in the South Bruce area, and they're called the Practically Hip, which I was like, I like that. I like that a lot. So Trent University's Indigenous department has a program called Just Get Over It, which highlights the challenge that some people have in understanding the ongoing relevance of past events. From your perspective, how have you seen this sentiment play out? And do you feel that Canada has moved toward a better understanding of these historical issues since the TRC?
I think it's still challenging. I mean, whether it's TRC or Indigenous issues more generally, you see something that's posted on social media or in a newspaper, and then you look at the comment section, some of it's just so awful. And I don't think it's representative of Canada as a whole, but it's representative of the way some people feel. So clearly there's more education required for all of us. And I think that if people don't see that progress is being made, then maybe the knee-jerk reaction is, you just need to get over it, which I think is unfair. I mean, there's a lot of other things that we commemorate in Canada, whether it's wars or sacrifices of people or internment of people, or that we wouldn't say, oh, just get over it. We'd say people's feelings are important, histories are important, and we need to be able to commemorate that and to recognize that. So I think that can't you just get over it sentiment is ill-informed and hurtful. So folks that want to go that way just have to get over it thing, and because I'm sure they don't want to apply that same sentiment to all parts of their own life, let alone the life of a country. Mm-hmm. So education's clearly important. And I think that, some of the work that's being done out there in terms of healing and working with families intergenerationally are all part of a process of understanding in families and in communities. And that's significant. And we should all be supportive of that. I mean, who wants to think about an entire community that's in pain? Mm-hmm. Or a family that's in incredible pain? Like, that's not helpful for any of us. So we shouldn't want that or wish that on anybody. And I think as a country, we need to be supportive of that, in particular because we were part of making that happen as a country. So we got to be generous as a country, and we got to be patient as a country, and we got to be kind as a country in terms of how people are understanding their own histories and the history of their family and healing.
Yeah, I love that. What are some steps that you think are still needed to deepen this understanding?
You know, I'd really like to see Canada take, like the government of Canada, federally, and the provinces and territories play an even greater role in terms of emphasizing the importance of reconciliation and celebrating good things that are happening. Because good things are happening out there, and oftentimes we don't hear about it. And maybe it's easier to broadcast bad news than good news. I don't know. I mean, that seems to be the case. But to see governments really step up more, and to see governments take on some of the responsibilities that they've been asked to take on through those 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to really grab them and run with them. That would be significant. And I think that we're seeing in different levels of society, in different provinces, how the education system has really grabbed on to truth and reconciliation, and I think that's marvelous. And we see that all the way from kindergarten through to university in some provinces. Some provinces really need to step up more, no question about that. So seeing that happen, I think, is going to be part of the, maybe not a sea change, but a change for the positive, or adding energy to a positive momentum that's pretty nascent, but it's out there and it's visible and it's measurable too.
Amazing. So building on this idea of moving forward, how do you balance the need to address the historical injustices with the need to also foster positive, forward-looking dialogue and solutions?
Yeah, I think part of it just requires like an open mind and some generosity, and I don't think it's a sequential thing with everything. Like as societies, we're able to do more than one thing at the same time, and and not everything has to be consistent with the other. So we need to understand that some of those painful histories and legacies, they require a process that are going to be guided by Indigenous communities in terms of their own Indigenous therapies and processes in terms of healing. At the same time, Indigenous communities deserve the very best, whether it's clean drinking water or schools or healthcare. They deserve at least what other Canadians expect and already receive. So there's a question of equity that isn't tied to legacy. It's things that need to be done in terms of how we can look at ourselves as a country and say people are being treated fairly. And to have the first people of your country being treated the most unfairly in terms of those issues, like moldy housing, like unsafe drinking water, like imprisonment in rates that are astounding. I mean, to have the Indigenous youth population in Canada be 8%, but the percentage of Indigenous, the percentage of youth being incarcerated who are Indigenous is like 55%. Like, there's something really, really wrong with that. So there's work that needs to be done. One of the things that I really thought was interesting as we were coming to grips with COVID, and it kind of seemed like COVID was moving away, that wasn't going to continue to impact on us, and people saying, oh, I can't wait till things get back to normal. I was like, the last thing that we need is normal, because normal meant that our Indigenous people in Canada were suffering. That's normal. And for some reason, we seem to not feel terrible about that. And it may be that most Canadians don't know what's going on, but the government of Canada knows what's going on. Mm-hmm. And they have the ability to vote resources to create monumental changes in our communities. I mean, it's one of the things that I've noticed in the last several budgets is the amount of money that's going into education on reserve. It's increased dramatically. And I think that's so important, because you may not see like an immediate impact, but 5 years from now, the number of kids that end up being successful in high school mm-hmm. and going on to college is going to increase. And how they influence their children in terms of encouraging them to do well in school. I mean, that's part of the sea change that we're looking for. So I'm really proud of all the money that's being put into education and into healthcare. And at the same time, we're still dealing with those issues, some of the child welfare issues of the past, the residential school issues of the past. So you can do more than one thing at the same time. I think the ability to be able to articulate that to Canadians in a way that folks will say, that makes sense what we're doing as a country, and I support that. I think we need to do a better job as a country in terms of articulating those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cultural differences can sometimes lead to misunderstandings or conflicts, especially in contexts where Indigenous and non-Indigenous mm-hmm. perspectives intersect. So given your experience lecturing on culture and conflict, how do you approach resolving conflicts that arise from cultural differences? And how can initiatives like those at the NWMO help to move past conflicts related to lands and resources?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I tend to think of conflict in maybe a bit different way than other people do. And when I taught conflict resolution and was a practitioner, I really focused on dignity, not that, well, bad guy, good guy, and how do we sort of figure out so that everybody's just kind of part bad and part good or something, whatever that equation looks like. The way I thought about things was that it was important for people to understand their own dignity and to be able to appreciate the dignity in others. So it required some work, it required an ability for frank conversation and an ability for people to really open up about who they are and what's important to them. And in my processes, I've kind of translated that into some of the work that I do now in terms of dignity, in terms of how we work with communities and people that we work with. And I love this saying that I said it wrong for years and years, that a project or a process moves at the speed of trust. And trust is built over, I used to always say 1,000 cups of tea. And then somebody told me, no, it's 100 cups of tea, which seems more reasonable to me, given that I'm not a tea drinker. So, but it means time, right? You don't get trust like that. It requires time. And trust is like another one of those key ingredients in terms of trying to bridge culture and bridge differences. And I think understanding that there's a real beauty in difference too. And I think about, things that I was taught as a kid, kind of how bland it might be if you went and looked at a flower garden and they were all the same color and the same size and the same everything. I mean, they might be nice from a symmetry point of view, but how much more beautiful it is when there's all these beautiful colors that are in there and different types of flowers, all living together and complementing each other. So I kind of think of things that way too, sort of the beauty that's inherent in difference, and how to expose that with people. And then I'm really big on asking people to be patient and to try to understand, and don't draw lines in the sand before you need to, because oftentimes they just become a barrier to understanding it and a barrier to be able to receive information and say, oh really, well now I have to change my position. People sometimes are really reluctant to change their position, especially after they've drawn a line in the sand and told people that this is the bottom line. I mean, where do you go from your bottom line? So that's that can be really, really hard to do. So I mean, that's the way I kind of looked at things as a practitioner, and a lot of that has really informed how I try to operate in my current role at the NWMO, to bring some of those things into play, and just that idea that there's inherent goodness in everyone, and sometimes it's hard to find, but it's there. And what can we do to help expose that to the world? So that's a bit of what I try to do.
Yeah, I love that. What do you hope will be your personal legacy in the context of truth and reconciliation in your work at the NWMO?
I'm really hopeful that that the NWMO ends up being viewed as a corporate leader in terms of implementing Call to Action number 92. That they took risks, and that they were they tried to do things in a mindful way that it wasn't just a checkbox exercise, and that it was as much about sort of a culture shift and an education for individuals who worked at the NWMO or were close to the NWMO, and not just sort of some corporate thing where, you know, it's something you hang on the wall or you have a button to be proud of something. That there was actual change for people, and they could feel it in their heart and in their spirit, and maybe they told their children about it or their grandchildren. Those are the types of things that I'm really excited about and see the great potential in. And in terms of personal legacy, I'm not really sure. I think I kind of think that idea of manifest the outcomes you're trying to achieve, that I've been doing that, and that's been part of my work at the NWMO, is to do that, manifest the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and to have kind of nudged NWMO along in terms of manifesting that idea about reconciliation in real practical ways that impact on people and impact on communities, and not just sort of a slick logo or something that you know, we put on the website and say we're committed to reconciliation, but we've have a way of really being proud of what we've done in terms of manifesting that commitment to reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. That's great. How do you want your contributions and the contributions of your colleagues at the NWMO to be remembered and built upon by future generations?
That's a tough question. I mean, if I maybe if I sort of thought ahead in terms of what the impact of our work might be that some of the communities that have lived side by side with each other for dozens of generations that don't really know each other, that down the road they'll be friends, and they'll care about each other, and they'll work together in a manner that they have never did in the past, and I think that would be significant, and that NWMO as a corporation will have taken the work that you and I have worked on with our colleagues in terms of a reconciliation policy and made it 10 times better than it is now, in terms of really making it part of the DNA of the organization. And the organization couldn't imagine being any other way except being thoroughly vested in reconciliation, that's who they are. And that when they think about their journey as an organization, that they would look at, you know, some of the things like when we were at King City, at Kingbridge, and we signed that statement of reconciliation together, and they seen all those beautiful faces in that circle and said, oh yeah, those are the folks that did that pioneering work. Because we're like pioneers. Like, there's no reconciliation for dummies out there. We're inventing it. You and I are, and our colleagues are, and the communities that we work with are. And it's not like a straight path, and sometimes we have to circle back and say, oops, we missed a turn or whatever. But that's what I'd like folks to see and to think about, that pioneering work was done, and there was people that took that on and had a vision something different than the status quo in terms of what might happen, and had a different sense of what the potential is of all of us as human beings to accept new truths and to co-create something different for the future. I really love the idea that if there's nothing else that we have in common, the one thing that we do have in common is we all want something better for our children and for our grandchildren. So if nothing else can help bring us together, or to help focus us, or to say, you know, we really need to hold that pen together and write that future together and encourage our kids to do that together. That idea that we're part of creating a different future. So when, you know, we all talk about 7 generations teaching, and 7 generations goes back and it goes forward. So we're part of writing that history right now for the next 7 generations. And so I guess part of that is kind of thinking like, whether it's 3 generations or 5 or 7 generations, that they can look back and say, we did a really good job in terms of planting some seeds and watering them and caring for them and nurturing them, and that they've blossomed into like a whole forest of reconciliation. That would be really cool.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful analogy. If there was one key message or insight that you could share with non-Indigenous Canadians to help them to better understand the experiences and perspectives of Indigenous peoples, what would it be, and why do you believe that it's crucial for advancing reconciliation?
You know, that's such a hard question, and I'm not too sure. It's hard, I think, to say, well, you're here from, name a country, and you can imagine terrible things that had happened in that country in the past, and to sort of do that country by country and say, well, recall, you know, why are you here? Maybe you came here as a refugee. You were escaping horrors. You were escaping persecution. You were escaping genocidal activities. This is our home. We had nowhere to escape to. And just thinking about, you know, the words of the Pope when he was leaving, he talked about that a genocide has happened here. That's a big deal to say that. It's not just like, well, some bad things happened, or as people used to say, well, you know, I had mean teachers when I went to school too, you know. Well, mean teachers doesn't equate to genocide. So, and I think finding a way of talking about that in a way that doesn't shame people or to blame people, because these things happened in the past, sort of say, well, it's your fault. Or you should act out of you should be so ashamed of this that you're going to do something. I know the elders that I talk to say that shame isn't a really good foundation to build change upon. It's important to create understanding, for sure. But I think we need to be really careful about how we do that, and to find ways of encouraging people to bring their very best selves forward. People talk about moral leadership, and I think in terms of reconciliation, that idea about that moral leadership is required. And it's not just from elected politicians, it's from all of us, because we're all leaders in some way. So bringing our very best selves forward, I think, is important in terms of nation building. And part of this project of nation building that we're all involved with includes ensuring that there's a significant voice for Indigenous people in terms of both how this country operates and how decisions are made in this country. There's no question about that. So to me, the idea of reconciliation, it's already done. I mean, it's already out there somewhere imagined, and we're just hopefully walking that path in a way that leads us there. And we're not falling off the trail too many times, but we're going to. So it really takes courage. It's like that idea about you come to a fork in the road and you can either stay with that which you know is comfortable and that where you feel safe or you have the courage to try to do something different. That's where we're at as a country. And we need that courage to try to do something different. Otherwise, it's the status quo, and the status quo doesn't serve us. Not just Indigenous people, but there's whole parts of this country where the status quo doesn't serve people very well. So we need to imagine something different. That's a courage-based project, and it's a heart-based project. And so I'm really hopeful that we can do that. I mean, I've seen that right across this country in terms of some of the inherent generosity that exists in this country, and how we harness that, and is I think one of our challenges. But I think we can figure that out too. So when we were setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the things we did is we brought people to Canada from all over the world who had worked on truth commissions or truth and reconciliation commissions to understand some best practices, things to do, things not to do. And one of the things, I guess a couple things that I learned from that was, one, there is no template. That much of what happens in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is reflective of the issues that are at stake and the nature and culture of the people in that country. So we had to be agile, adaptive, maybe just like us at work, adaptive phase management. The other thing that was said, and it was by Paul Chartrand, a wonderful Métis scholar who I just admire so much. And he had talked about studying Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and what they need in order to be successful. And he said that they need the support of people. He said, but there's a real fragility to it as well. And in talking about that fragility, he said, you know, it's kind of like in the springtime or maybe in the fall, maybe you have like a little pond in front of your house or some puddles, or the ditch has some water in it, and there's that really, really thin ice. And he said, that ice is really fragile. And he said, and if you just like kind of grab it, it just crumbles in your hand. Like if you try to own it, you can't. But if you get a bunch of hands together and you all put your hands together and you can lift up that ice, you can hold it up and it becomes like a prism. And that sunlight shines through there and it becomes this beautiful rainbow that shines on all of us. And we all benefit from that. But the key is putting our hands together and working in a cooperative fashion rather than somebody wanting to grab it for themselves. And he said that's what's required to be able to stand up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think just to further that, that's what's required to implement the work of the TRC too. It requires all of us to put our hands together, to work in a cooperative fashion, maybe even a loving fashion, for our children and our grandchildren. And that we pick up that spring ice and we let it shine on ourselves, but also let it shine on an incredible future for future generations. That's the key for how we become successful as a country. That's the way I think about it anyway.
Yeah, I love that.
On September 30th, we encourage you to not only reflect on these historical wrongs on your own and in conversation with your friends and families, but also consider how you can take action to contribute to reconciliation. You can do that through things like donating to causes that support survivors and their families, or volunteering at a community event in memory of those children who never returned home. In order to achieve true reconciliation, we must work together to ensure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and instead do things differently to make Canada safer and more inclusive for future generations.